saying, I recently sat down and watched this film again, and I had forgotten what an amazing film it was, so congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's a film I made in 2002, and it was, for me, a sort of a slight departure from the usual horror kind of material that I was doing. In this case, it was moving more into suspense, crime thriller, and my influences were American conspiracy thrillers of the 70s, like Parallax View, Marathon Man, 3 Days of the Condor.
So, how do you feel with your films coming out like this now on streaming platforms? Because it kind of opens up your films to a whole new generation of audience. So, how does that make you feel?
Yeah, well, Silent Cry had a very sort of staggered distribution life because when I first completed the film, the sales agent that was selling it kind of fell out with the producer, and the producer, after a year of selling it, the producer tried to move to another sales company. That sales company went bust, and then a third sales agency came on board about 2 or 3 years later, and by that time the film's lifespan in the world of sales and distribution was more or less over. So the film was actually encumbered by all that moving around between one sales agent and the other. So that was very frustrating when you put so much effort into making a film and then it sort of falls at the last hurdle because of circumstances that are out of your control. So I sort of wrestled with the rights, and I think it was like 10 years later I was able to get a certain amount of control and release the film in the US on DVD. But at that time, digital wasn't as advanced as it is now. It was sort of just beginning.
Yeah.
So it had a limited DVD release in the US in 2013. But now, more recently, I've focused on digital. DVD is more or less died a death in most territories, and digital is the new platform to release films. And through digital, you can get a much wider release, and the film can be accessible in many more homes. So I was able to get a digital release through Amazon Prime. In the UK and in the US and hopefully other territories. I'm looking at Australia and New Zealand at the moment too. So it's exciting, to sort of to bring the film back into distribution at various stages when opportunities allow.
Now, you mentioned earlier that this film saw you move away from horror into more of the thriller crime kind of genre. Can you remember back, what was it that made you make that move away from horror and go into a new genre for yourself?
It was really the script. The script was written by Simon Lubert, who was a client of the same talent agency, Michael Lewis and Associates, that I had in the US. And my agent sort of introduced me to Simon. And Simon sent me that script, and immediately I identified elements in it that were, very much a part of a genre of cinema that I really appreciated and really enjoyed. And also, of course, it's a classic woman in peril kind of story, torture heroine, which is, the classic Hitchcock kind of approach to suspense. One of the my fascinations with horror is not so much the blood and guts; it's suspense. I think suspense is a very cinematic language, and therefore I thought the script gave me the opportunity to flex my muscles with that kind of narrative.
It's one of the things I quite often find myself writing in reviews these days, that a lot of the big blockbusters that come out just don't seem to know how to do suspense anymore when it comes to cinema. What would your advice be to young screenwriters out there who are writing suspense into a script?
So suspense is a tricky one in a way, because it's the classic Hitchcock question: a suspense versus surprise. Do you show the bomb under the table before it goes off, and therefore build suspense, or do you just let it go off suddenly and completely surprise your audience? And there's always a conflict between those two approaches, and I find that with today's audience, they've seen it all before. They've seen the bomb under the table before it goes off, and they know what's coming next, and it's somewhat predictable. Today's audience, I think, are looking more for surprises, it's about striking the balance between the two. I think when you do handle suspense nowadays, you have to. It can't be contrived in any way. You have to be, very real and organic about it, and it has to convince.
You mentioned before that you took inspiration from a lot of 1970s kind of suspense thrillers when you were working on this film. Was that a genre of cinema that you were generally in love with?
Yes, it was, more so during film school. Before film school, my diet of cinema was predominantly sort of horror and war and westerns. And when I went to film school and started to discover, sort of the new wave of cinema after the studio films, so films like the French New Wave, British Free Cinema movement, Italian neorealism, and then ultimately the American New Wave. And it was through the American New Wave that I began to discover filmmakers like Alan J. Pakula, for example, that did Parallax View. It was through sort of a love of American independent cinema of the 70s that I started to appreciate that genre. Even films like Coma, Michael Crichton, anything that really involved a protagonist in peril, being chased or pursued through an environment, through a labyrinth of sorts, and then just playing the cinematic tools, playing with suspense, playing with surprise, playing with twists and turns. Oops, I just got to turn this on. There. So it's something that a filmmaker can have a lot of fun with, because it is very much a part of cinematic language. You just have to look at any Brian De Palma film to see what you can do with montage and mise-en-scene, what you can do with editing and long developing shots. It's very much a part of cinematic language.
How do you feel that they influence what you did here with the film? Like, are there things that we should look out for when we sit down to watch the film again now that you kind of did as a homage to that genre?
Well, yeah, I mean, there are some scenes that take place in one shot, one long developing shot. For example, there's a scene between the cop and the doctor in a park, where the camera revolves around the characters in one shot. There's no edits there. Yet the fact that the camera is revolving 360 is a way of sort of externalizing the kind of panic that they're in. That the situation that they're involved in is now out of their control. And that's me as a director trying to use the camera to somehow externalize that cinematically. And then there are quite a few montage sequences throughout the film, like when the janitor, the hospital janitor, is sneaking into the doctor's office at night to try and get information and evidence as to what's going on with the babies in the hospital. And that's I remember actually I think that was one of the first scenes that we shot, and we did something like 56 shots in one day, and then on the second day we did like another 54. So in 2 days I'd done like 102 shots, and the producers were panicking because they thought I was overdoing it. I didn't know what I was doing, and I was just trying to get as many shots as I possibly could because I wasn't sure what shot I needed, and that wasn't the case at all. What I was doing is I was constructing a very elaborate montage scene. It's like Hitchcock's shower scene in Psycho. You need lots of different angles, and it took a while for me to get them to understand what my approach was and what I was doing. So that's another example of where montage, can work. It's in some ways it's a luxury. Nowadays, you don't have the time to shoot a montage scene like that because you don't have the budget.
Yeah.
On Silent Cry, I had a £3 million budget. It was $5 million. A recent film I did, Reborn, I had $300,000. So I shot Silent Cry in 6 weeks, 6-day weeks, and I shot Reborn in 3 weeks.
Yeah.
So in some ways, you'll see evidence in Silent Cry of what I can do on a budget, whereas on Reborn, it's more a case of what you can do with a Rumpelstiltskin kind of production where you have very limited resources, but you've just got to tell the story.
Yeah, I think it's every parent's worst nightmare to have their child go missing. I know I'm not a parent, but I know some of the hardest things I've ever had to watch and report on working in radio has been parents talking when their children have been kidnapped, and we've had some horrific cases here in Australia. How difficult was that for you to capture that emotion and that stress and that parents go through when a child is missing, and then put it into the character of Rachel?
Well, it was very, very much the job of Emily Wolfe in the story, and by coincidence, she'd just become a mother herself. So she had I think a 6-month-old baby when she was making the film. So that in itself was a big problem for her because she was having to spend so much time away from her first child. So the anxiety of that somehow found its way into, I think, her character. So it's also a case, I think, that when you're dealing with something so emotive as that, there's a danger of it becoming melodrama. There's a danger of overdoing it, and I think maybe there's one or two scenes where it does tip over the balance a bit, but generally speaking, yeah, I mean it's something that you rely on the script to provide the ammunition, if you like, and then the actor or the actress delivers the emotions.
How did you discover Emily for the role as well? Because a lot of this film's success bordered around her being perfect for that role. How did you discover her?
I've been a fan of hers for several years before making Silent Cry. I'd seen her in The Full Monty. I'd seen her in Photographing Fairies, and I thought that she had a lot of interesting qualities, which seemed right for Silent Cry. She's quite petite, and she's quite pretty, but she's also smart, and then sort of a strong kind of intelligent kind of character. So I thought all those elements kind of worked for what I was trying to do.
You also had to have the villains around her as well, and those people that are causing her character stress. Tell us a little bit about how you went about casting those roles as well.
Yeah, well, it was an interesting casting process because, again, this is a British film. So we were going for social realism in a way, and therefore I wanted characters that felt like they really were from that environment rather than actors playing that they were from that environment. Hence, you had the character played by Steve Sweeney, the homeless guy, who is very authentic. And I sort of discovered Steve through Gary Oldman's film Nail by Mouth, and just thought that he would be perfect for Silent Cry. And then when you've got sort of patriarchal family doctors, to get somebody in like Frank Finlay, for example, was just the perfect casting. And again, I'd become a fan of Frank Finlay for years, and it was wonderful to have the opportunity to get him in for a week, to play that part. And then Kevin Whately, again, what was interesting about Kevin Whately is that generally he comes across as the nice guy. He's the cowboy in the white hat, not the black hat. But in Silent Cry, it's very much casting against grain. That he turns out to be the villain. Not the ultimate villain. The ultimate villain is played more by Clive Russell. But sometimes, when you've got good guys and bad guys in your story, you don't want to cast too much, with black and white hats. You want sort of a grey area and to play against the melodrama of the narrative and try and make it more authentic and more real.
Definitely. Now, the other thing, too, that really stood out about this film is the amazing soundtrack. It's got music by the Chemical Brothers, the Cranberries, Morcheeba. How much of an input did you have with that soundtrack? Because it's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, they were all my favourite bands at the time. And I can remember when we were editing the film, the editor, Les Healy, I always let the editor sort of do the first assembly without any interference from me, just so that I can see a different view of it. And Les worked with a lot of temp scores that he would put in there, and he filled the film with music, which was always actually my intention. I felt that this was something that would lend itself to that approach. I was thinking of David O. Russell and Scorsese and Tarantino here, that the soundtrack of the film isn't just the original score; it's also third-party music that you license and put into the film, and you create a soundtrack from that. But the funny thing was I didn't really like Les's choice of music. I sort of liked what he was doing with it, but the bands that he was choosing were not really my kind of bands. They were a little bit too mainstream.
Yeah.
So I wanted to go for something a little bit more alternative, a little bit more indie, and so Morcheeba, Cranberries, Chemical Brothers, Tricky. These were all my favorite bands at the time. So that's really. I went through loads of different bands and different types of music to reach what I was looking for. But it wasn't me imposing my personal taste on the film. It was also, I felt this was music that was coming out of the characters in the story. I would imagine that Emily's character would listen and like Morcheeba, and probably the Cranberries too. Whereas, I suppose Tricky represents some of the more urban, gritty and sort of drug-induced elements of the story, and Chemical Brothers was really more the action and suspense, and it was actually out of those tracks that the composer David Hughes came up with the sound really for his soundtrack to the film, his original score. With Morcheeba, you have a lot of music that's in reverse. It's electronic and it's in reverse, and so we sort of used that for the soundtrack of the film too. So it all feels organic.
Definitely. Well, it all comes together, and the result is an absolutely fantastic film. So, Julian, I guess to finish up the interview, what would you like to say to people out there before they sit down and watch Silent Cry once again?
Well, I'd like to say that one thing that Silent Cry does is that the whole intention is very, very much in a Hitchcock kind of way, is to present you with a strong female protagonist who goes through absolute hell to achieve her goal and overcome her obstacles, and she gets there in the end, and she goes on a journey too, and the journey is very much her perception of the world that she finds herself in, and how that perception changes. I think she meets characters in the story that she would cross the street to avoid in normal life, and the situation that she finds herself in forces her into getting close to those characters and getting to understand them. There's a sort of a class element in the film. She's from quite a privileged background in a way. And a lot of the characters in the story are not so privileged, and some are, but they're corrupt. So there's a lot of subtext to the story that, even though it's shot in 2002, it's still relevant today. So I think it's full of some interesting sort of subtext elements that an audience is going to find interesting.